On the 1st of September 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. This is the military action that really begins World War II. World War II is the most devastating conflict mankind has ever known. But to understand how the situation got to this point, we must go back years, at least until the end of World War I. The Treaty of Versailles had ended the Great War, and Germany had been badly decimated after losing territory and being ordered to pay disproportionate compensation to the victors. The Germans needed a leader to unite them as a people and to remind them of glorious times past, and that's why a guy like Hitler rose up. A frustrated painter, but one who knew how to channel the rage and longings of an entire country. If you can give a villain like Hitler credit for anything, it's that he was a great speaker and a master of propaganda. He told the Germans of the superiority of their race and instructed them on the steps they needed to take in order to restore the nation's greatness. Hitler developed his rhetorical powers in speech after speech, eventually becoming the leader of the German Workers' Party, which was soon transformed into the National Socialist German Workers' Party. A party that championed nationalist, supremacist, and racist ideas with strong anti-Semitic and anti-Marxist components. In 1923, Hitler found himself in prison after a failed coup. During his imprisonment, he took the opportunity to write Mein Kampf, which means My Struggle, a crazy book of poor literary quality that would end up being the gospel of Nazism. After his imprisonment, Hitler returned to the political stage and would end up winning a simple majority election in 1932 to become the German Chancellor the following year. The Third Reich was born. The Third Great German Empire emerged right in the middle of a global economic crisis. Quickly, under the guise of legality, Hitler established a totalitarian regime by liquidating the democratic institutions of the Weimar Republic through a legal loophole. Members of the Communist Party of Germany were immediately arrested and confined to concentration camps. The persecution of Jews by Nazism became an active policy. The Führer ignored the obligations for Germany related to the Treaty of Versailles, instead creating a strong military state with timid protests from France and England. In 1938, he began to implement his policy of territorial expansion by incorporating Austria into Germany's domain. That same year, Hitler threatened to trigger a European war unless the Sudeten, an area on the Czechoslovakian border with a majority of German ethnicity, was ceded to Germany. To resolve the matter, representatives sat down to speak in Munich: Germans, French, English, and Italians. The Czechoslovaks themselves were not invited. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and his French counterpart, in an act of lukewarmness and cowardice, gave way as long as there was to be no military action. It was a miscalculation. The following year, Hitler broke his word and occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. Churchill harshly criticized Chamberlain with the phrase, "You were given the choice between war and dishonor. You chose dishonor, and you will have war." And so it was. In order to build his great empire, Hitler's plans began with the annexation of Poland. Poland was a country that had only come into existence because of the Treaty of Versailles. Their lands had previously belonged to Germany, Austria, and Russia. The Poles had been granted a strip of land so that the country would have an exit to the Baltic Sea through the Danzig Corridor, which divided Germany in two. August 1939. The communist Stalin and the anti-communist Hitler, two totalitarian leaders, surprise half the world with the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, a German-Soviet treaty of non-aggression. Two irreconcilable enemies vowed not to attack each other. 9 days after the signing of this pact, Hitler invaded the western part of Poland, and 3 weeks later, the Soviets were invading the eastern part. Hitler and Stalin, in a secret clause of the pact, had divided Poland for themselves. The invasion of Poland finally led to England and France declaring war on Germany. Germany took a break to regroup its ranks, while the British and the French remained on the defensive. Journalists called this period the Phony War. The English sent troops to France to stop the Germans. The British Expeditionary Force French and English troops stood behind the Maginot Line, a defensive wall built after World War I that the French thought was impregnable. During this period of calm, the Soviet Union attacked Finland. It wasn't easy, not at all. The Soviets suffered countless casualties. Ultimately, Soviet forces failed to fulfill their main objective, that of conquering Finland. They only managed to conquer some border territories. Hitler thought that the Red Army was a weak army made up of subhumans. The Führer became very confident following his annexationist advances, and in the face of the passivity of many European leaders, he was constantly moving. He soon occupied Denmark and Norway. The Germans finally ended the phony war in May 1940, after simultaneously attacking Luxembourg, Belgium, the Netherlands, and France. The method was the one previously used in Poland, the Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War. They managed to put their panzer tanks in a place thought to be impenetrable to a modern mechanized army, the Ardennes Forest. It looked like the Allied army would be surrounded. The Battle of France seemed lost. At the end of that month, a dramatic operation to evacuate Allied troops on French territory took place in the town of Dunkirk. Germany could have dealt the Allied army the final blow at this point, but some kind of miracle must have happened, because Hitler let more than 300,000 soldiers escape. The motive? We just don't know. Today, it is a debate that continues to elicit countless theories. The Battle of France didn't last much longer. On the 22nd of June, Hitler met with several senior French officers who requested an armistice. Hitler selected the same place and train carriage where the armistice was signed with Germany in World War I. This time, the tables were reversed, and Germany occupied the winner's seat. That's how the war in France ended. France was split into two. An occupied portion that included Paris, and an unoccupied portion controlled by a Vichy-based collaborationist government chaired by Marshal Philippe Pétain. It was known as Vichy France. Charles de Gaulle immediately rebelled against the Vichy government and proclaimed Free France. He also called for the formation of the French resistance. Italy and Germany, two fascist powers, united in 1936 in a union that Mussolini called the Rome-Berlin Axis. Mussolini, the leader of the Italian fascist party, seeing the ease with which Hitler conquered countries, felt sure that he'd chosen the winning side. He had approached Albania and joined the Germans by declaring war on France and England. Il Duce, emanating Julius Caesar, wanted to expand his holdings further, as Italy, like Germany, had come late to the colonial division. His plans were to conquer Greece and Egypt, but Hitler had to go out of his way to help the Italians, who, more than helping Germany in the war, were actually a burden. The Italians can't beat the Greeks, and help arrives. In the end, the Germans invade Greece through Bulgaria. Mussolini would then attack British bases in Egypt from Libya. The goal was to take the Suez Canal, the gateway to the British colonial empire. But what had happened in Europe after France's defeat? What happened to the British? Churchill, the new prime minister following Chamberlain's resignation, refused to sign an armistice with Germany. Hitler decides to go all out, but conquering England would not be so easy because of its island status. The English managed to heroically defend their island in the Battle of Britain, a battle that was fought mostly in the air. The Luftwaffe against the RAF. Churchill would utter another of his great war phrases. He left us with many. Never was so much owed by so many to so few. For more than a year, Britain alone withstood the war for the Allies. The Nazis had been bombing England's most important cities for months. Hitler believes he dominates the situation and sees himself as a clear victor, but the English resist and fights back strongly. At the end of the year, Adolf Hitler met with General Franco in Hendaya, a French town bordering Spain. Hitler wanted Spain to enter the war on the side of the Axis powers. In the end, they did not come to an understanding. Franco was willing, but the country was going through a huge crisis after the Spanish Civil War. Spain, while providing logistical support, opted for the role of non-belligerent. Hitler had managed to get Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria to join the Axis forces. Only Yugoslavia was missing. A change of government in that country precipitated its invasion in April 1941. Hitler dreamed of a German empire ranging from the River Rhine to the Volga. It is at this time that Hitler decides to expand borders and undertakes Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. The big motivation was Russian oil. Stalin, Hitler's former ally, is caught a little by surprise. Hitler was not expected to break his alliance so soon. The operation had been delayed by the invasions of Greece and Yugoslavia. Finally, in June 1941, the Germans mobilized between 3 and 4 million soldiers. At first, the Germans won campaigns and territory with ease. In a month, Belarus and the Baltic republics, previously occupied by the USSR, were in German hands. Hitler estimated that a few months more of campaigning would be enough to take Moscow. But the harsh winter arrived, and Hitler's armies were left at the gates of the city. The same thing happened to Napoleon in his day. The Rome-Berlin axis had been expanded in 1939 with the Union of Japan. Japan was the most advanced country in the East, and it wanted to rid its neighbors of the yoke of the West, that is, the Eastern European colonies. Asia for Asians was a common phrase among Japanese people. As early as 1931, the invasion of China began, which continued in 1937. When Germany occupied France, Japan took control of French Indochina. The US government, presided over by Roosevelt, responded with a trade blockade and oil embargo. The only way out for Japan was to retreat or go to war. The Japanese launched a surprise attack on the American base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii in December 1941. The sleeping giant woke up, and Roosevelt delivered his famous speech in which he declares a state of war between the United States and the Japanese Empire. After Pearl Harbor, the Japanese invade Hong Kong, and within months, Singapore, Burma, Thailand, the Dutch East Indies, the Philippines, a kind of tsunami or Japanese lightning war. The flag of the land of the rising sun flies over the Pacific, and then Hitler declares war on the United States. This signed the final death sentence. Defeat was then only a matter of time. A new naval battle begins to take place in the Pacific. In the Atlantic, the battle had been raging since the beginning of the war. In this theater of war, the German U-boats sank a huge number of Allied ships, mostly supply ships. In an effort to avoid a bloodbath, the role of the Allied intelligence was key, specifically the deciphering of the Enigma machine used by the Nazis. Some experts point out that the war was shortened by 2 years due to this Allied success. Back in the Pacific, the Americans got revenge 6 months after the Pearl Harbor attack in 1942, specifically at the Battle of Midway, a tough setback for the Japanese, in which they lost 4 aircraft carriers. The tables had begun to turn. In Europe, Churchill approved massive bombardments of the German civilian population. Meanwhile, in North Africa, the German troops of Rommel and the Italians win some campaigns, but are ultimately defeated in the Battle of El Alamein. That marks a change of course. The Germans fail to reach the Suez Canal, and with it, their pincer plan to go for the Middle East's oil reserves starts to fade. The Germans also plan to conquer the Caucasus oil fields. It is then that Hitler decided to divide his forces and go after Stalingrad, in order to strike Stalin with an ego blow. After all, it was the city that bore his name. A bad move by the Führer. Although the Germans conquer much of the Caucasus, their troops end up retreating, as their gaze was fixed on Stalingrad. In early 1943, the Germans surrendered after the long Battle of Stalingrad, the bloodiest in human history. The serious defeat of Nazi Germany and its allies in the city was a real turning point and was decisive in the final outcome of the war. From here, the Germans would start to lose ground to the Russians. In July of that year, the Germans failed to stop the Red Army in the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in history. That same month, the Allies bombed Rome, causing great demoralization to the Italians. They were convinced that the Allies would never bomb the Holy City. To add to the insult, they knew that by then they were losing the war. They would end up turning against their former allies. Soon, they'd depose Mussolini and arrest him. A tough setback for the Germans. The Italians had betrayed them. On the 4th of June 1944, the Allies arrived in Rome and liberated it. On the 6th of June, a huge contingent of Allied troops landed on the beaches of Normandy. The Germans were already retreating from the east, and now they began to retreat from the west. The Allied advance is uncontainable. They waste no time getting to Paris. When the Allies crossed the German border, the Germans launch a desperate offensive in the Ardennes that has no effect. In the Pacific, Japanese troops vanish. The actions of the kamikazes only slightly delay the US offensive. In January 1945, the Red Army arrived at the Auschwitz concentration camp in Poland and freed thousands of prisoners. The public is beginning to learn of the horrors of the Jewish Holocaust and its real effects. More than 6 million Jews were killed by the Nazi regime. In February, the Allies shelled Dresden, one of the largest bombings on a civilian population in the entire war, almost destroying the entire city. In April, the Russians arrived in Berlin and won the last European battle. That same month, the shooting of Mussolini and the suicide of Adolf Hitler took place. Eventually, Nazi Germany surrenders unconditionally to the Allies. World War II in Europe ends, but the war continues in some parts of Asia and Japan. It took 2 atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August to ensure the surrender of Emperor Hirohito's tireless army.
Stehen.